transcendence. When everything's gone wrong and you are ruined, outcast, flawed, reduced to nothing by authorities and greed, and made a victim by official justice, leaving you no choice but suicide just to end the terror, harassment and victimization, at least in the refuge of meditation, and you find yourself alive in spite of all and simply have to make the best of it in carrying on, enduring and continuing forward, you will find life rather comfortless, and searching in it for a break or meaning, you are more dead than alive and more a suicide than if you actually did commit it. There's the advantage, the awareness of that you are not, of your own total definite defeat, that you are not the total loss, destruction and adversity, but untouched by that as something else and something better, like a phoenix rising from the fire of destruction on another pair of wings than the consumed ones, flying higher and with better strength to greater light. You are not all that which is lost, defeated and annihilated, but a higher entity of a supremer kind than any mortal bog of vanities and worries. Love compulsory by destiny. I never tire of your beauty, nor of the exquisite richness of your hair, the very element of affluent beauty, always growing, never growing old, like some established permanence of the very basic essence of life's worth, as the most stable and reliable escape resort when you are failed by everything in the material world, and most of all by those who should have been supporting, but who could do nothing else than let you down. But you are there, in contrast to a world of treason that brings only torture, bitterness and disappointment, while you are the opposite in some miraculous turned wonder, contrary to all things mortal, neutralizing all indecencies, in being only beauty, both in spirit and in physical appearance, like a miracle, confounding all the mundane laws of nature and presenting obstinately perfect evidence that all the evils of the world, adversities and tragedies, are but mirages compared to the reality of beauty. Kulturföraktet. Vad är så föraktligt med kulturen? Vad är så föraktligt med latin och grekiska? Varför är det så föraktligt med historisk kunskap? Varför ville Skolverket ta bort all bibelkunskap och all kunskap om antiken ur vår läroplan? Vad är så föraktligt med all bildning utom att den inte bär sig? Skall då humanisten skrotas för att hänvisas till socialen eller rännstenen, och hans fattigdom befästas och legitimeras, erkänd som korrekt och riktig, för att han ej är det minsta praktiskt samhällsnyttig eller lönsam? Är då den kapitalistiska och ekonomiska aspekten det allena giltiga kriteriet på vad som är gott och nyttigt? Har då skönhet, ädelhet, god smak och kreativitet ej någon talan? Skall det bara köras över, skrotas och föraktas som parasitism? Då föredrar man barbariet framför civilisationen. Då låter man brutaliteten våldta skönheten och sanningen. Då kör man över humanismen och all mänsklig medkänsla med robotmässig maskinell okänslighet och hänsynslöshet. Så legitimerar ignoransen sig mot kunskapen i kortsynt, tanklöst, blint komplex av mindervärdighet, och gör man den uppbyggliga, bevarande och skapande kulturen till martyrer. Cultural disdain. Why is culture so disdained? Why is Greek and Latin so disdained? Why is knowledge about history so contemptible? Why did school authorities desire to remove all knowledge of the Bible and of classical antiquity from national curriculum? What is so contemptible about refined and higher culture, except that there is no profit in it and it doesn't pay? Is then the humanist to be discarded and turned over to the gutter and to social welfare, with his poverty confirmed and made officially legitimate, established as correct, since he is practically of no use and brings no profit? Is then the economic and capitalistic aspect as criterion the only valid one for what is good, acceptable and socially correct? Has then beauty and good taste, nobility and creativity no say? Are they to be just scrapped, disdained and driven over then as parasites? That is how barbarity is then preferred to civilization, then brutality is given leave to ravish truth and beauty. Then humanism is driven over with all human empathy by automatic inhumanity, insensitivity and ruthlessness. Thus ignorance legitimizes her own limitations against knowledge, in short-sighted, thoughtless, blind inferiority complex, turning the constructively conserving and creative culture into martyrs. Grämelsen. Man kan dö av den förintande självuppgivenheten med för mycket mer än vad man orkar med av sådant som man ångrar. Mest ens egna misstag med dess konsekvenser, men och allting annat som hade kunnat gå på annat sätt. Det är säsong för självmord med förlamande iskallaste mörker och kyla, då allt universum med dess mörka makter tycks blott vilja överväldiga dig med sin skoningslöshet. Finns det något ljus i änden av den mörka tunneln? Legenden påstår det, men så länge du är inne i den ser du varken något ljus eller någon ände på den. The new paradigm. The problem is that man has lost all credibility. He has made a mess of all the world by wars, pollution, extirpation of wildlife and animals, a global poisoning of nature by exploitation, ruthlessness of greed and dehumanization. So there is no wise man to believe in or to trust man anymore. He is biologically bankrupt, turning all his megacities into dumps of poison, ruining all nature, his own livelihood. So we have all kinds of global crises. Now this world threat of corona, worst in 100 years, that could be seen as something like Dame Nature's own revenge on man, an effort to restore the Gaia balance, saving life on earth from man, the monster menace. We don't know what will come out of it. We are in the beginning only so far, but all signs point to a revolution, a new paradigm to which we must learn to adapt ourselves. Ett nytt paradigm. Problemet är att människan förlorat all trovärdighet. Han har förstört all världen genom krig, miljöförstöring, utrotning av andra arter, både djur och flora, en förgiftning av naturen över hela världen. Så det finns sig någon sansad man med som kan tro på människan, som biologiskt är bankrutt, som skapat megastäder som har urartat till giftiga skrottippar, som blott spyr ut mera gifter, som förgiftar all naturen, det han har att leva på, i omedveten självmordsdrift av egen dumhet, ignorans och vägran att förstå sig själv. Så vi har globala kriser av universella varjehanda slag, och nu har vi coronahotet som kan ses som något av naturens egen hämnd på människan för hennes oansvarighet och ett försök att återställa en balans i Gaia, i ett livräddningsförsök av livet och naturen från den mänskliga suicidala destruktiviteten. Vi vet inte vad det här ska leda till då vi alltjämt befinner oss i början, men allt tyder på en sorts revolution och ett nytt paradigm som vi blir illa tvungna till att acceptera genom anpassning därefter. Att överleva sig själv. Jag har gjort det många gånger, lika betänkligt varje gång. Att nödgas fortsätta i trots mot allt förnuft när allting talar för att man har ingen rätt att leva. Mänsklighetens existens är mer än någonsin ifrågasatt när hon är världens främsta fiende och parasit genom sin ohyggliga miljöförstöring som globalt riskerar allt liv i naturen, inklusive henne själv med hennes rovdrift, egoism, kortsynta hänsynslöshet och självdestruktivitet. Så kommer detta virus nästan som en frälsare för naturen och miljön och lamslår människan med kanske permanent, paralyserande vidskepelse i form av en fatal basilskräck mera effektiv än någon sjukdom som får hela hennes omänskliga samhälle att lugna ner sig, som genom en högst hälsosam förlamningssjukdom, som en mordängel långt värre än på Moses tid. Naturligtvis är mycket av dess hysteri absurd i sin groteska, överdrivna, löjliga panik som friska människor ej kan ta på allvar, medan de som måste överleva ofta måste finna det betänkligt att det ej, när det var möjligt, inte fick gå under som de ville. Involuntary survival. I have done it many times, each time with equal misgivings, having to survive in spite of common sense, when everything would argue for your death. Man's right to live is more than ever questionable, as she is the foremost enemy and parasite of nature in outrageously destroying the environment, putting all life of the world at risk, including her own egoism, short-sighted ruthlessness, and universal self-destructiveness. Then comes this virus, almost like a world redeemer for Dame Nature, the environment and all organic life, with perhaps a permanent and paralyzing superstition by a horror of contagion more efficient than a world disease, compelling all society to slow down to some afterthought, like some most wholesome illness of paralysis. Of course, much of the panic and hysteria is exaggerated, going to extremes that no one in his right mind can take seriously, while those who have no choice but to survive must oftentimes find it a wearing burden that they were not granted the convenience to depart when they would have preferred to. Förtvivlan. En god vän till mig begick självmord, ett fall som gått till historien genom den drastiska sortin, en del som förgiftats genom fel genom medicinering, tar fram en k-pist och skjuter ner omgivningen för att avsluta orgiemassakern med avrättningen av sig själv, medan andra behåller sin egen förtvivlan begravd i sig själv för att slutligen ge den ett uttryck genom sitt eget offer, som Henning, som lade sig ner över spårvagnsspåret. Om livet blott upplevs som en upphörlig förnedring som blott oavbrutet förvärras och blir mera plågsam i en ständigt accelererande uthärdlighet, vem kan då ha något att anklaga en stackars självspilling för? Är det inte logiskt att med varje medel avsluta ett outhärdligt lidande som blir bara värre och som ej kan botas? Självmordsstatistiken är lavinartat i växande på grund av den pågående coronakrisen, med folk som hoppar ut från broar och tar gift och dricker sig till medvetslöshet eller värre, medan gamla avlider i instängdhetens terror. En konkurs är dock ej mera än en utmaning av livet, ingen anledning till självförintelse och ej ditt livs slutliga ruin, då livet alltid fortsätter ändå. Men du kan alltid göra något av det, och det minsta du kan göra är det bästa av situationen. Despair. A friend of mine committed suicide, a case that made impression by its most dramatic exit. Some are poisoned by exaggerated medication and are driven to extremes to gun down people with self-immolation as a grand finale, while more timid people bury their despair and anguish in themselves, like my friend Henning, ending up by laying himself down across the railway track. If life is felt as merely a continuous humiliation, constantly more painful and exacerbated, who can then accuse a poor and wretched suicide of anything? Is it not most natural and logic to conclude by any means an unendurable ordeal of suffering that only can get worse, for which there is no cure? There is a surge of suicides now because of the corona crisis. People jumping off from bridges, taking poison, drinking themselves to perdition, or old people dying from the terror of confinement. Bankruptcy is no more than a challenge thing, no reason for self-immolation or the ruin of your life, since life will always go on anyway. And all you can and should do is to make the best of it under the circumstances. Overlove. It was the basic problem of my life, that I would always overdo it, going to extremes emotionally in my love and deep sincerity of oversensitive affection, sometimes bordering on suicidal tendencies. That was the case of Goethe's Werther, which was a most personal experience by that poet drowning in his overwhelming passion for a lady he could never make himself quite understandable, thus ending up in self-consumption of his overbearing love, and Goethe found it maybe even harder and more difficult to have to outlast and survive that crisis. As a poet said, consumed by that which he was nourished by. Love turning into a perpetual nightmare for the oversensitive, emotionally vulnerable poet, of constant sleeplessness and torturous unrest, with no release or possibility of a redemption ever. As such deep and strong sincerity of love must be the very essence of the poet's personality, an innate and insatiable urge to just go on in blind love and affection in perhaps eternity, like Paolo and Francesca in that hurricane of hell that keeps on harrowing its prisoners of love forever, which Dante witnessed and could understand, as yet another poet suffering of overlove that never could find any satisfactory and proper outlet. Suicide as a therapy. Suicide statistics are increasing in the wake of the corona epidemic, often as a consequence of bankruptcy and ruin, people feeling at a loss for having lost the meaning of their lives, the motivation for to stay alive at all. But naturally, suicide must be dissuaded from by all and every means, as it is the ultimate defeat and giving up in cowardice. However, using suicide as a therapy can be constructive. doubting all your values and your life, delusions and your vanity, and finding a detachment from it all, mundanity and your material existence, can be only beneficial for your personal development, like any meditation can be only good and useful. Suicide, then, as therapy and a consideration, is not then to be despised and feared, but can be actually a better therapy than most, especially in times of crisis, trial, and extreme conditions. The lie of lies. People always tended to go crazy about money, in a sickly greed that blinded them to life's necessities, and even to reality, thus driving them over the cliff in some kind of a mass psychosis, like a crowd of lemmings, altogether joining to commit collective suicide in a senseless and short-sighted chase of vain futilities, believing blindly in the lie that money is the same as power, while the contrary is closer to the truth. With money you are chained to limitations in the form of worries and material concerns, and you must carry blinkers against anything that isn't property or money. You are only free without concerns of mortal worries, and true power lies in freedom only and true independence. Mortal powers usually rush headlong into self-destruction in blind ignorance of higher laws of karma or of destiny, which no one ever could control, but which instead controlled all human lives on earth by giving lessons of experience and fate as the eternal cosmic education of all life, that is not mortal, but must carry on continuously forever. The rejected lover. All I wanted was to love and give, which wasn't very well received, but mostly with misunderstandings, taking my goodwill as something negative and dangerous to be aware of and repel, with depreciatory response and disregard. Must love them be confined in isolation and sustained and activated only in protection against baseness, failure to appreciate, ingratitude and ignorance and bad vibrations, like a morbid attitude of short-sighted self-limitation? There is no bitterness, but only disappointment, with a commonness of insufficiency of human nature, that should be divine with capability of understanding everything, but which, as we all know, was capable of crucifying Christ. Realism without bitterness. Never mind my presence, since it does not matter, since I am as good as dead, and more alive and active as a ghost than among all restricted mortal idiots of the mundane slavery and morbid world of only self-destructive flesh and escapism at best. I loved you, but have no pretensions, make no claims on you, and have done well without you, while you always can be certain of my love, if even you would choose to scrap me and discard me, which I took for granted you would do from the beginning. The strangest love. The strangest love is that which in maturity endures, to spite all time, surviving all disasters, hibernating through defeats and downfalls, to like someone shipwrecked, saved by some old plank, against your will is brought ashore when all you wanted was to die, which would have been the best of all. But destiny has always thwarted you and saved you for the obligations of your love, as you will never be allowed to cease to love, but that hard work will be your constant hell forever, like a grinding wheel you never are released from. You have to resign, accepting it and make the best of it. You have no other choice, so just get on with it and love forever. The sculptor. They were very young and colleagues, fellow students at the art school, being brilliant both as budding sculptors, with a natural endowment for creative, realistic art, and she was beautiful and only 19. He was slightly older when he asked her whether he would be allowed to make her portrait. She, of course, was only happy to cooperate, and so he sculpted her in all her mature teenage beauty. Then the war broke out and everything was interrupted. The art school had to close and he had to go out to war. He never came back any more but fell a casualty among too many. He was last male member of his family which died with him. All she was left with was his portrait of her. She continued as a sculptress all her life. The portrait always stayed with her and had an honoured central place, bearing witness of her youthful beauty through all ages, as perhaps a testimony also of his lasting and undying love of her. Skulptören. De var unga och kollegor, konststuderande vid konstakademin i huvudstaden. Båda synnerligen lovande som blivande skulptörer, realistiska och kreativa. Hon var 19 år och han var något äldre när han frågade om lov att få skulptera hennes huvud. Hon var bara glad åt att få samarbeta, så han fångade i en porträttbyst hela hennes skönhet i dess fulla ungdomsmognad. Så bröt kriget ut och allt kom av sig genom avbrott. Konstakademin fick stänga och själv måste han dra ut i kriget. Han kom aldrig mer tillbaka utan blev ett offer bland de allt för många. Med honom dog svärdslinjen av hans familj ut. Allt som återstod av honom var för henne hans porträtt av henne. Hon var aktiv som skulptris genom hela livet och porträttet hade alltid en central och hedrad plats i hemmet som en vittnesbörd om hennes ungdomsskönhets tidlöshet och kanske även om naturen av hans odödliga kärlek. Det var 1939 och konstakademin var Ateneum i Helsingfors. Skulptören var Christian Sibelius, brorson till kompositören. Hans kvinnliga kollega var min mor. When darkness is not enough, let me drown you in my tears of blood to compensate the fact that darkness never was enough for comfort, although smothering to death the heart, to cure it of its cruel immeasurable aches of limitless atrociousness in unfair disappointment, of black holes of desperate frustration. Let me love you all the same, with all the passion of our common painfulness, to cure its wounds and damages and irreparable losses, simply by in humble prudence share the torture of your soul that keeps on screaming in resounding anguish throughout all the universe, although it is in its outrageous recklessness beyond all hearing and all human understanding except mine. När mörkret inte är tillräckligt, låt mig dränka dig i blodets tårar för att kompensera mörkrets tröst som aldrig var tillräcklig, fastän det försökte kväva dig till döds i smärtan av omätligheten av ditt hjärtas plåga, i oändlig grymhets orättvisa och besvikelser, i svarta hål av din förtvivlans frustrationer. Låt mig icke desto mindre ändå älska dig med hela smärtan av vår innerliga och gemensamma passion, för helandet av skadorna och såren av oreparerbara förluster, bara med att i försiktig ödmjukhet få dela din själs outsägliga tortyr som skriker i oändlighet, genljudande i hela universum i sin ångest, fastän den i all sin oerhörda gränslöshet är utom hörhåll och allmänsklig fattbarhet förutom min. Unhappy love. What love is not unhappy? You are seduced with flying colors, follow gloriously your leading lover on his course until it all cracks up in a disastrous mess of pitfalls, of adversity and disappointment, ruin and defeat. What marriage does not end in quarrels and disruption, infidelity, betrayal and divorce by separation? What relationship could possibly avoid that one betrays the other? And what children do not learn to be deluded, disillusioned, disappointed by their parents, and let down by their own family and left alone? Love is a self-destructive, self-consuming, sadomasochistic, never-ending, bitter one way only of self-torture. And still, that's the only thing that keeps you going on. Olycklig kärlek. Vilken kärlek är ej olycklig? Man låter sig förföras gladeligen i hänförelse och följer härligheten i sin älskares ofelbarhet och ledning tills allt brister i katastrofala nederlag av motgångar, besvikelser, ruin och sammanbrott. Vad äktenskap tar inte slut i gräl och bittert avbrott, otrohet, bedrägeri och oundviklig separering? Vilken relation kan undgå att en part bedrar den andra? Vilka barn kan undvika att bli besvikna på sina föräldrar, desillusionerade och övergivna, svikna mest av sina egna? Kärleken är självförtärande, självdestruktiv och sadomasochistisk i en återvändsgränd utan slut av aldrig upphörande självtortyr. Och ändå är det bara den som driver dig att ändå hålla på.